Story number 1, the 13th floor patient. I swear on everything, I should have never taken the night shift that winter. The pay was good, sure, but the things I saw, they weren't worth any amount of money. It started on the coldest night of the season. The snow outside was relentless, thick sheets of white, burying cars in the parking lot, making it nearly impossible to see past a few feet. The hospital felt unusually empty, the silence stretching through the dim hallways, interrupted only by the occasional beep of machines or the low murmur of a late-night television in a patient's room. I was the only nurse on the graveyard shift for that wing, a fact I usually didn't mind until that night. At around 2:30 a.m., I was updating patient charts when the call light for room 1309 blinked red on my monitor. My fingers froze over the keyboard. That wasn't possible. Our hospital didn't have a 13th floor. I knew it for a fact. The building went from 12 straight to 14, skipping 13 like most high-rises do to avoid superstition. I blinked, thinking I must be overtired. A glitch in the system, maybe. But then it blinked again. A patient was calling for help from a floor that didn't exist. My first instinct was to ignore it. Maybe it was a system error, or maybe I was imagining things. But the moment I looked away, a cold breeze crept down my spine. Unnatural, considering all the windows were sealed shut. The air smelled sterile, but underneath that, something else, something rotten. I grabbed the hospital phone and called the front desk. No answer. The blinking light continued, steady, insistent. Against my better judgment, I stood up and made my way to the elevators. My footsteps echoed in the hallway, the usual warmth of the hospital replaced by an unnatural chill. So when the elevator doors slid open, I hesitated. I knew this was a terrible idea. But something about that call light, something about the way it pulsed, felt personal. I stepped inside, pressing the button for the 14th floor, hoping to prove to myself that I was imagining things. The door shut. The elevator hummed softly as it ascended, the familiar shift of motion in my stomach as I watched the numbers tick up. 9, 10, 11, 12. Then the lights flickered. The elevator lurched. The button for the 14th floor went dark, and then the number 13 lit up instead. I stared at it, my pulse hammering in my ears. This had to be a mistake, a glitch. But when the doors slid open, my body locked in place. This wasn't the 14th floor. Hell, this wasn't even the hospital I knew. The hallway stretched into unnatural darkness, dim emergency lights flickering above, casting long, unnatural shadows against the peeling walls. The smell was worse here, stronger. Rotting meat mixed with the sharp bite of antiseptic. The floor beneath my shoes felt soft, like it had absorbed something wet. And then I heard it, a soft wheezing from the room at the very end of the hallway. Room 1309. I should have left. I should have pressed the damn close door button and never looked back. But my body moved on its own, drawn forward by an invisible pull, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The doors to the other rooms were all slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of hospital beds filled with writhing shapes, their outlines distorted like static on an old television. My gaze forward, my fingers trembled as I reached for the handle of room 1309. The metal was ice cold, burning against my skin. I turned it. The door swung open. The room was identical to every other patient's room except for the fact that the bed was already occupied. A man lay there covered in thin hospital sheets, his face sunken, skin as pale as the snow outside, but his eyes, they were open, wide, fixated directly on me. The beeping of the heart monitor was slow, unnaturally slow. It made my own pulse feel deafening in comparison. "You finally came," the man whispered. His voice was like wind through cracked glass. I stepped back. My legs were shaking. I think there's been a mistake," I stammered. His eyes didn't blink. "You shouldn't be here, but now that you are, you have to stay." The lights flickered violently, the temperature dropping even more. My breath came out in thick, white clouds. I turned to run, but the door had vanished. The walls began to darken, peeling away like burnt paper, revealing something black, pulsating underneath. The man in the bed sat up, his bones creaking with the motion. "Don't leave me again, nurse," he murmured. Again? The air grew heavier. It pressed against my chest like a weight, my vision darkening at the edges. And then I saw it, the reflection in the blank TV screen. It wasn't just the patient in the bed. There was something behind me. Something tall, too tall. Its arms were too long, its fingers ending in blackened, jagged nails. It was watching, waiting. My body snapped into action. I lunged for the bed, gripping the patient's frail wrist. "Who are you? What is this place?" I demanded. He only smiled, and then he whispered, "You've been here before." Something grabbed my shoulder. The room plunged into darkness. I woke up on the floor of the elevator, gasping, drenched in sweat. The overhead light was flickering. The doors were still shut, the button for the 14th floor blinking calmly. Had it been a hallucination? A nightmare? My hands trembled as I reached for my hospital badge, rubbing my fingers over its familiar shape, grounding myself in reality. But then I noticed something. A hospital bracelet was on my wrist. Patient name, unknown admission date, December 13th. Floor 13. The doors slid open to the brightly lit 14th floor. A nurse glanced at me. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a laugh, shook my head. But as I walked back to my station, my hands clenched in my pockets. Because the truth was, I wasn't sure I had left the 13th floor at all. Story number 2. The snowbound morgue. I should have called in sick that night. Something in my gut told me not to come. But I ignored it. The roads were barely visible under the thick layers of snow, and by the time I made it to the hospital, the entire city was on lockdown. The blizzard outside was the worst we'd seen in years. Winds howling, snow piling up against doors and windows, trapping us inside. There were only a handful of us on the night shift. A couple of nurses, one doctor, a security guard, and me, the poor soul assigned to the morgue. It wasn't my usual station, but staffing was low, and they needed someone to check on the backup generator. The last thing anyone wanted was for the temperature in there to drop too much. Dead bodies had to be kept cold, not frozen. I took the basement elevator down, the air growing stale as I descended. The morgue was always colder than the rest of the hospital, but tonight it felt different. It wasn't just cold. It was the kind of bone-deep chill that made my teeth ache. The moment the doors slid open, a wave of unease hit me. The hallway was too quiet. The overhead lights flickered slightly, casting long, unnatural shadows across the floor. I swallowed the discomfort creeping up my spine and stepped inside. The sound of my boots echoed in the silence, each step hesitant. The morgue was just up ahead, a single metal door at the end of the hall. It had no windows, no signs of life, just the dull humming of the cooling units from the other side. I exhaled sharply, shaking off the nerves, and pushed the door open. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't the usual sterile coldness of the morgue. There was something else beneath it, something rotten. I hesitated before stepping inside. The rows of metal drawers lined the walls, each labeled with a name and a number. And the cursor in the corridor, disers and done of them. Part of the room were all empty, except for one. A single body bag lay unzipped. The sheet pulled halfway down. That wasn't right. I took a step closer, my fingers tightening around my clipboard. The generator was running fine. The temperature was steady. So why was that body partially uncovered? I leaned over to read the tag. No name, just a case number. But the ink looked faded, smudged, like it had been written a long time ago. Then the power flickered. The hum of the cooling system stuttered. The overhead lights dimmed just enough for the shadows in the room to stretch, twist, and for a moment, I swore one of them moved. I told myself to leave. Whatever this was, it wasn't my problem. But just as I turned for the door, the body bag twitched. My breath caught in my throat. I stood frozen, heart pounding in my ears. It had to be my imagination. The cold air, the flickering lights, the isolation, all playing tricks on me. But then it moved again. A slow, deliberate shift, as if something inside was adjusting, waking up. I backed away. My hands fumbled for my radio, but before I could call anyone, a sound broke. The silence. A deep, wet, gurgling exhale. I nearly dropped the radio. My legs locked in place as the zipper of the body bag started sliding downward. I should have run. I should have left the moment I saw that zipper move, but some sick part of me needed to know, needed to see. The bag peeled open, inch by inch, revealing gray, sunken skin stretched over a skeletal frame. The eyes were open, staring directly at me. Glassy, lifeless. But the mouth moved. "It's so cold," it whispered. I screamed. The radio fell from my hands, cracking against the floor. I spun toward the door, my boots skidding on the tiles as I lunged for the handle. But the moment my fingers touched the metal, the door slammed shut on its own. I pounded against it. "Help! Somebody! I'm stuck in here!" No answer. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, hear the slow, deliberate movement behind me. I turned. The body was sitting up. Its neck creaked as it tilted its head, watching me. Then the room shifted. The walls darkened. The air turned thick, heavy, pressing down on my chest. The gurneys weren't empty anymore. Bodies lay on each one, silent still, but their eyes were all open, staring at me. The cold was unbearable. My breath came out in thick, white clouds. I tried to force myself to believe it wasn't real, that this was some hallucination from the lack of sleep. But then one of them moved. The nearest corpse turned its head, its jaw snapping open in a grotesque, silent scream. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the closed morgue door. My fingers fumbled over the handle again, pulling, twisting, but it wouldn't budge. My own breath was the only sound in the room, harsh and ragged. Then the voice came again, not from the body bag, not from the corpses on the gurneys. It came from inside the walls. "You should not be here." The overhead lights shattered. Darkness swallowed the room. I don't remember what happened next. The next thing I knew, I was waking up on the floor of the hallway, outside the morgue doors. My hands were numb, my skin damp with cold sweat. The lights in the hallway flickered weakly. The door to the morgue was slightly open, but inside everything was normal. The gurneys were empty. The cooling system hummed softly, The body bag was zipped shut. Had I imagined it? Had the cold and exhaustion played some cruel trick on my mind? I shakily stood up, grabbing my fallen radio. Static buzzed through it before a voice finally came through. "Hey, we've been looking for you. Everything okay?" I stared at the morgue, my pulse still racing. "Yeah," I lied. "Just got locked in for a bit." I forced myself to walk away, but as I headed back to the main floor, something made me glance down at my hand. There was a smudged name tag stuck to my palm. It had one word on it: mine. I dropped it instantly, my stomach twisting. I never went back to the morgue after that. And I never, ever worked another snowstorm shift again. Story number 3. Do not answer. Room 309. The first time I heard the call from room 309, I thought it was a mistake, a system error, a glitch in the hospital's ancient intercom. It was 3:09 a.m., exactly when the voice crackled through, weak and breathy. "Nurse, please, help me." I checked the patient logs, scanning through the rooms. 309 was empty. It had been for years. After what happened there, the hospital had sealed it off, turned it into a storage room that no one was supposed to enter. I radioed the front desk. No one else had gotten the call. The intercom system was too old to pick up interference, so that excuse was out the window. It wasn't possible. And yet, it happened again the next night. "Nurse, please, I need help." My skin went cold. I knew the story, of course. Everyone who worked here long enough did. Years ago, a doctor hanged himself in room 309. They found him dangling from the ceiling, his face bloated, eyes bulging, the cord cutting deep into his swollen neck. The patient he was treating that night, she died too. No one knows how. The cameras stopped recording at the exact moment she flatlined. Some nurses said they still saw shadows moving behind the door, even though it was locked, that sometimes at exactly 3:09 a.m., the call light would blink, just for a second, before shutting off again. I told myself it was just a story, something the older nurses made up to scare the new hires. But the next night, the call came again. "Please, it hurts. Nurse, don't leave me here." My stomach twisted. I didn't answer. I turned off the intercom and ignored it, but ignoring it didn't make it stop. I started seeing movement in my peripheral vision, dark shapes shifting at the end of the hall. I started hearing footsteps behind me when I walked past room 309, but no one was ever there. One night I walked past it and heard fingernails scraping against the door. I should have reported it. I should have refused to work that wing, but I was too damn curious. So, the next night, at exactly 3:09 a.m., when the call came through again, I did what I swore I'd never do. I answered. "Hello?" My own voice sounded wrong. Small silence. And then, so softly I almost didn't hear it. "Come inside." Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to turn around, to forget this ever happened. But my feet moved forward. The hallway was colder than usual, my breath coming out in thick clouds. The door to 309 was locked, but as I reached for the handle, it clicked open on its own. The smell hit me first, rotting flesh. The room was pitch black. The emergency light flickered, casting long shadows against the walls. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I stepped inside. The hospital bed was still there, covered in dust, but it wasn't empty. A woman sat in the bed, her head bowed, hair hanging over her face. My pulse thundered. "Hello?" She didn't move. The light flickered again. And then I noticed her feet weren't touching the ground. She wasn't sitting. She was hanging. My breath caught in my throat. The air in the room shifted, thick with something heavy, something wrong. She lifted her head. Her eyes were completely black. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. She opened her mouth. You should not have answered. The door slammed shut behind me. Darkness swallowed me whole. The room stretched, the walls twisting, warping, something crawling in the shadows. The woman wasn't alone anymore. Shapes shifted in the corners, long fingers scraping against the walls, a wet, gurgling laugh echoing from somewhere too close. I stumbled backward, my chest tightening. Let me out! My voice came out hoarse, raw. Something moved behind me. Cold fingers brushed against the back of my neck. The whisper came again, directly in my ear. Stay! I slammed my fists against the door. Let me out! The intercom crackled. A voice, my own voice, came through. Nurse, please, help me. A hand grabbed my wrist. I screamed. The lights flared blinding white, and suddenly, I was outside the room. I fell to the floor, gasping for breath, my uniform damp with sweat. The hallway was normal, bright, warm. The door to room 309 was closed. I scrambled to my feet and ran. The next morning, I demanded to see the security footage. It showed me walking up to room 309. It showed me standing there staring at the door, but I never went inside. The footage cut out at 3:09 a.m. When it came back, I was on the floor, alone. I quit that same day. I don't know if it was real. I don't know if she was real. But sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I still hear it. A whisper crackling through the radio. Nurse, please, help me. Story number 4. The man under the bed. I should have listened to her the first time she said it. I brushed it off as post-surgery delirium, a side effect of the anesthesia. But when she grabbed my wrist with those trembling fingers and whispered, "There's a man under my bed," I felt something cold settle in my stomach. It was past midnight, and the hospital was quieter than usual. The snowstorm outside had sealed us in, making the whole building feel like a trapped, frozen tomb. My shift wasn't even supposed to be in this wing, but my friend Clara had been admitted after an emergency appendectomy, and I promised to stay the night. She had been fine earlier, groggy but fine. But now, her wide, bloodshot eyes darted toward the edge of the bed, her face pale under the dim blue light of the monitors. "There's no one there, Clara," I murmured, squeezing her hand. Her breath came out in short, panicked gasps. "He's been there all night. I can hear him breathing." I glanced at the narrow space beneath the hospital bed. Shadows pooled underneath, stretching into the darkness. The rational part of me knew it was impossible. The rooms were sterile, monitored. The doors were locked at night, but the hairs on my arms stood on end. I forced a smile. "It's just the meds. You're hearing things." She shook her head violently. Her nails dug into my skin. "Check, please, just check." Something about her voice made my stomach churn, the sheer terror in it. I swallowed and knelt beside the bed, taking a slow breath. I felt ridiculous. Nothing was there. But still, my hands were unsteady as I grabbed the edge of the mattress and lifted it just enough to peek underneath. At first, all I saw was darkness. Then my eyes adjusted, and I saw him, a man, lying on his stomach, arms bent at odd angles, body twisted like something broken. His face was inches from mine, his mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. His skin was ashen, dry like something long dead. But the worst part? His eyes were open, and he was staring right at me. My breath caught in my throat. My whole body locked in place. The air around me thickened, colder than it should have been. Then, slowly, so slowly, he began to crawl forward. I let go of the bed so fast I nearly fell backward. The mattress dropped with a dull thud. My heart slammed against my ribs as I grabbed Clara's arm. "We need to go." She was already sobbing. "You saw him, didn't you?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I reached for the call button, my fingers slamming it repeatedly. No response. I turned toward the door, ready to run for help, but it was already open, wide open. The hallway outside was pitch black. The overhead lights had flickered off at some point, leaving nothing but a yawning void. The entire floor was silent. Something moved in the dark, a slow, dragging sound, a sharp clicking, like nails tapping against the tiles, and then breathing, shallow, wet, too close. I grabbed Clara's fourth stand and yanked it, wheeling her toward the door. I didn't care if she wasn't strong enough to move. We had to leave. We had barely made it 2 feet before the lights sputtered back to life. The hallway was empty. I sucked in a breath, my own pulse roaring in my ears. The air was still thick, heavy with something unseen. Clara was shaking. She buried her face against her knees, whispering over and over, "I told you. I told you." I forced myself to look back at the bed. Nothing. The space underneath was empty. The room was silent again. I knew what I saw. I knew. But there was nothing there now. I pressed the call button one last time. This time, a nurse responded. She came in, her expression blank with exhaustion. "What's wrong?" I hesitated. What was I supposed to say? That there had been a man under the bed? That he was watching us? Smiling? She looked between Clara and me, waiting. "There was someone in the room," I whispered. The nurse's expression didn't change. Then, after a long pause, she sighed and glanced at the hallway. "We hear that a lot," she said quietly. My breath hitched. "What?" She hesitated, looking at Clara, who was still curled up, shaking, before turning back to me. "Patients, especially in this wing. They talk about seeing someone under the bed." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "We've checked the security cameras. No one ever comes in, but the patients always describe the same thing." I swallowed hard, my hands trembling. She glanced at Clara's chart, tapping her fingers against it before nodding toward the hallway. "We'll move her to a different room." I didn't argue. We left the room, never looking back. They transferred Clara to another floor, closer to the main station, and I stayed with her until morning. Neither of us slept. By sunrise, the storm had calmed. The roads had been cleared enough for visitors and new staff to arrive. My shift was long over, but I didn't want to leave her alone. At 7 a.m., as I stepped into the hallway to grab coffee, I saw 2 nurses wheeling a bed down the corridor, a bed from Clara's old room. My stomach dropped. The mattress was missing. The frame was bent, twisted, broken. The nurse from last night walked past me, her expression tired, wary. "They always leave something behind," she murmured. I turned back toward Clara's door, my hands clenching. I didn't tell her what I saw, because in the daylight, with the hospital bustling again, it was easy to pretend it hadn't happened. But that night, when I finally went home, I hesitated before climbing into my own bed. And for the first time in my life, I checked underneath. Story number 5. The Last Shift of Dr. Wallace. The night I met Dr. Wallace, the snow outside had swallowed the entire city. The roads were impassable, and the hospital had gone into lockdown, trapping staff and patients inside. The power flickered on and off, and the generator groaned under the weight of the storm. It was the kind of night where time felt slower, where the silence of the empty halls pressed against your skull like a warning. I was the only nurse assigned to the overnight shift in the old wing, a section of the hospital that was mostly unused. The rooms were still operational, but the paint was peeling, and the equipment was outdated. Patients were only sent there when we ran out of space. That night, the blizzard had filled every available bed in the newer wards, so I was left managing the stragglers, people with minor injuries, waiting out the storm. At 2:17 a.m., I was finishing up my rounds when I saw him. He was standing at the end of the hallway, flipping through a patient's chart. His lab coat was crisp, unnaturally clean for someone who had been working a full shift. He looked older, maybe in his late 50s, with silver-rimmed glasses, perched on the edge of his nose. He had the kind of presence that made you feel like you should stand up straighter. He glanced up and gave me a polite nod. "Busy night, isn't it?" I hesitated. I didn't recognize him. I'd been working here for almost 3 years, and I knew most of the doctors who took night shifts. But maybe he was new. "Yeah," I said, shifting my clipboard. "You covering the overflow patients?" He smiled, tucking the chart under his arm. "Something like that," I nodded, brushing off the odd sense of unease creeping up my spine. "Well, let me know if you need anything, Doctor." "Wallace," he said. I froze. That name. It hit me like ice water down my back. Dr. Wallace had been one of the most respected physicians in the hospital. Every nurse knew his name. Every patient trusted him. But he had been dead for 10 years. I forced a laugh, shaking my head. "Funny, we had a doctor, Wallace, here a while back. You must get that a lot." He tilted his head slightly, his eyes sharp behind his glasses. "Is that so?" My fingers clenched around my pen. Something about his voice was wrong. It was too calm, too steady, like he wasn't surprised. I excused myself quickly, turning back toward the nurse's station. My pulse was hammering. I logged into the patient system, searching his name, my hands stiff from the cold. Dr. Gerald Wallace, deceased 10 years ago, cause of death, cardiac arrest on hospital grounds. The obituary flashed in my mind, something I had heard from the older staff when I first started. He had been found in his office, slumped over his desk. No warning, no signs, just gone. But I had just spoken to him. I turned back to the hallway. It was empty. The air around me felt heavier, colder. My own breath came out in thin white clouds. I tried to convince myself that I had imagined it, that maybe I had read the name wrong. But deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't the only one working the shift. The rest of the night, I felt him everywhere, a shadow moving just out of my vision, a whisper down the hallway when no one was there. Every time I checked the patient logs, I saw his name, listed as the attending physician. At 4 a.m., I decided to check the security footage. I watched myself on the screen, standing at the end of the hallway talking to thin air. My stomach twisted. My mind screamed for logic, for reason, but none of it made sense. Then the cameras glitched. The feed flickered. And for a single frame, a single frozen second, he was there, standing right behind me. His eyes were black. I slammed the monitor shut and ran. The corridors felt endless, stretching unnaturally long, the lights dimming with every step. My footsteps echoed too loudly. Something was wrong. I reached the nurse's station and grabbed my things. My only thought was getting the hell out of that wing. But then, the intercom crackled. His voice. "Nurse, please report to room 407. I almost dropped my bag. Room 407 was in the new wing. I hesitated. I should have ignored it, and I should have walked away. But some part of me knew he wasn't going to let me. The walk to the new wing felt like it took hours. My heart pounded with every step. The snow outside hammered against the windows, the storm refusing to let up. When I finally reached room 407, my hands were shaking. I turned the handle. The room was empty, but the chart on the bed had a name, Dr. Gerald Wallace. I took a step back. The bed was neatly made, untouched, but the heart monitor was beeping, steady, rhythmic, like there was a patient there. I reached out, and then the bathroom door creaked open. He stood in the doorway. His glasses were gone. His face was pale, sunken, the skin stretched tight over his cheekbones. His mouth opened, too wide, unnatural. I didn't wait. I ran. The hallway stretched endlessly before me, the walls warping, shifting. The overhead lights flickered violently. I could feel him behind me, the cold pressing into my spine. I made it to the stairwell, throwing myself inside. The moment the door slammed shut, the lights above returned to normal. The hospital was quiet. I gasped for breath, my hands shaking so hard I could barely stand. When I checked the patient logs again, the name was gone. Dr. Wallace had never been admitted. I don't know why he came back. I don't know why he chose me that night. But when I got home, I checked my coat pocket. Inside, there was a discharge form, signed at 4:07 a.m. by Dr. Wallace. I don't work night shifts anymore. Story number 6. The snowfall that never melts. The first time I noticed it, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. The courtyard outside the hospital, buried under the weight of endless snowfall, looked just like any other winter night. But then I saw it. A patch of snow that never melted. At first, it didn't seem like much, just a small area near the middle of the courtyard where the snow sat undisturbed, even on days when the rest of the lot turned into a slushy mess. I wouldn't have thought twice about it, but I worked the night shift. And the longer I stared at it, the more I realized something wasn't right. No footprints, no disturbances, nothing ever touched it. I asked an older nurse about it once, just in passing. She stiffened immediately, her expression darkening. "We don't talk about the courtyard," she said. That was all she gave me before walking away. That should have been enough. That should have been my warning. But I was too stubborn to let it go. One night during a particularly brutal storm, I found myself alone in the break room, staring through the large window overlooking the courtyard. The entire hospital was blanketed in white, the streetlights casting an eerie glow over the drifts of fresh snow. And then I saw them. Footprints. They led from the edge of the hospital doors to the patch that never melted. But what made my blood run cold was the fact that there was only one set. Whoever walked into the snow never walked out. I stood there, frozen in place, my pulse pounding in my ears. It had to be a trick of the light. A patient who wandered outside and got picked up before they could return. But deep down, something in me knew better. The hospital was locked down for the storm. No one had left. I forced myself to turn away, telling myself I was imagining things, but I barely made it 2 steps. Before, the motion Sensor. Light. In the courtyard. Flicked on. The footprints were gone. The snow was smooth. Untouched. I barely slept that morning, my mind running through every possible explanation. I told myself I had been exhausted, that stress was making me see things. But the next night, I stayed late, just to check again. And this time, I saw him. A man stood in the courtyard, right on the edge of the snow. His back was turned, his head tilted slightly as if listening to something I couldn't hear. I pressed a hand to the glass. "Hey." No response. I should have called security. I should have turned around and walked away. But instead, I grabbed my coat and stepped outside. The cold bit into my skin immediately. The kind of chill that cut through layers and settled in your bones. The wind howled through the empty courtyard, sending loose snowflakes swirling in the air. The man was still standing there. I took a hesitant step forward. "Sir, are you okay? You shouldn't be out here." He didn't move. I took another step, my boots crunching in the snow. The air felt wrong, heavy, and then I saw his breath, or rather the lack of it. No condensation, no mist curling in the air. I took a step back, every instinct in my body screaming at me to leave. His head turned slightly, just enough for me to see the edge of his face. His skin was gray, waxy, like something left in the cold for far too long. His eyes, they were wrong, sunken, dark, and empty. I turned to run, and then the snow grabbed my ankles. It was impossible. One second I was moving, and the next I couldn't lift my feet. The snow clung to me, burning cold, pulling me downward. I clawed at the ground, panic rising in my chest. The wind howled, deafening, like something was screaming beneath it. The man turned fully now, his mouth twisting into something that wasn't a smile. I yanked my leg free, falling backward into the snow. My breathing was ragged, my vision blurring with fear. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the way the ground trembled beneath me. I didn't look back. I threw myself through the hospital doors, slamming them shut behind me. My heart pounded against my ribs, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The security guard at the front desk blinked at me. "You okay?" I turned, expecting to see the man still standing outside, but the courtyard was empty. No footprints, no sign that anyone had ever been there. I never went near that window again. But sometimes, when I walk past it, I swear I see it. That patch of snow, still untouched, still waiting. Story number 7, the ICU visitor. I first noticed her on a Tuesday night, sometime past 3 a.m. The ICU was always eerie at that hour, the machines humming softly, the occasional beep of a heart monitor breaking the silence. The storm outside howled against the windows, thick snow burying cars in the parking lot, trapping us inside. Most of the patients were in critical condition, heavily sedated or unconscious, their bodies connected to machines keeping them alive. I was finishing my rounds when I saw her, a woman in a hospital gown, sitting at the bedside of room 217, a room that belonged to Mr. Holloway, a man in a coma for weeks. Her back was to me, her long, dark hair draped over her shoulders. Her hands rested gently on his, fingers lightly tracing the outline of his wrist. At first, I assumed she was family, maybe a wife, a daughter, someone who had managed to sneak in after visiting hours. But something about her posture made my stomach churn. She wasn't crying, she wasn't talking. She was just watching him. I took a hesitant step forward. "Ma'am, visiting hours ended a while ago. You shouldn't be in here." She didn't react. The machines in the room continued their rhythmic beeping, a steady sign that Mr. Holloway was still breathing. I tried again, this time stepping closer. "Miss, I need to escort you out." She tilted her head slightly, as if she had heard me, but then she simply turned back to the patient. My pulse quickened. The room was too cold, the air too still. I reached for my radio to call security, but just as my fingers grazed the button, Mr. Holloway's heart monitor flatlined. I jumped at the sudden shrill alarm. The woman didn't move. She kept watching. I lunged forward, instinct taking over, pressing the code button on the wall as I grabbed the defibrillator. My hands shook as I prepared to shock him. "Ma'am, I need you to step back." But the bed was empty. Mr. Holloway was gone. The sheets were neatly tucked, the IV line dangling loosely from the stand, the ventilator tube resting on the pillow. The woman was still there, still watching. But there was nothing left to watch. I stumbled back, my breath coming out in sharp gasps. My mind screamed for logic, for a rational explanation. But my body knew the truth. Something took him. The door slammed shut. The air in the room grew thick, pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. The fluorescent lights flickered violently above me, casting long, twisting shadows against the walls. And then, for the first time, the woman moved. She turned to face me. Her face was wrong. The skin was stretched too tightly over her bones. Her eyes were hollow, black, as if someone had scooped them out. Her mouth opened too wide, a soundless scream, twisting her features into something inhuman. I pressed against the door, my hands scrambling for the handle. Locked. The lights went out. A sharp, cold whisper slid against my ear. "He was mine." Something yanked me backward. I don't remember much after that. When I woke up, I was on the floor outside room 217, my head throbbing, my uniform damp with sweat. The hallway was quiet. Too quiet. The monitors hummed, the machines beeped, the world moving as if nothing had happened. But the bed in 217 was still empty. The patient log said Mr. Holloway had been discharged. Discharged at 3:09 a.m. But there was no paperwork, no records, and no one remembered seeing him leave. I quit working in the ICU after that, but sometimes when I pass by that hallway, I still see her, sitting in an empty room, waiting for her next patient. Story number 8, The Blood in the Snow. The first time I saw it, I thought I was hallucinating. It had been a long shift, the kind that stretched endlessly into the early morning hours, leaving my mind foggy and my limbs heavy. The blizzard outside had turned the hospital into an island of white snow, piling up against the windows, the roads buried, making it impossible for anyone to come or go. The whole city was frozen in place. I had just stepped into the break room, desperate for a few minutes of quiet, when I noticed it through the window. The trail of blood leading from the woods to the emergency entrance. Thick, deep red against the pure white snow. I stood there gripping my coffee cup, my breath fogging up the glass. The tracks weren't fresh, but they hadn't been covered by the snowfall either, which meant they had been made recently. I turned toward the security desk, expecting the night guard to be already handling it, maybe even calling for backup. But he wasn't there. The hospital was eerily silent, the kind of silence that only happens on the worst nights, the nights when people don't make it. I grabbed my radio. "Hey, did someone bring in a trauma case?" I'm seeing a blood trail outside. Static. I frowned. Maybe the storm was messing with the signal. Still, I couldn't ignore it. Someone could be out there, bleeding out in the cold. I grabbed my coat and stepped outside. The wind hit like a knife, slicing through my scrubs, the snow crunching beneath my boots as I followed the blood trail toward the edge of the woods. My heart pounded, every nerve in my body telling me this was a bad idea. The footprints were uneven, like whoever made them had been dragging their leg. The blood was thick, congealing around the edges, staining the ice beneath it. I called out, "Hello? If you can hear me, I can help?" Nothing. The wind swallowed my voice, carrying it into the trees. I hesitated at the tree line. The hospital lights only reached so far, casting eerie shadows against the snow. Beyond that, it was pitch black. I shouldn't go in. I knew that. But then I saw her. A woman standing just inside the woods, barefoot in the snow. Her hospital gown fluttered around her thin frame, her arms wrapped around herself as she shivered. Her head was tilted downward, her hair hanging in front of her face, her breathing coming in short, sharp gasps. My stomach clenched. "Miss, are you hurt?" She didn't answer. I took a cautious step forward, my boots crunching loudly in the silence. "Miss, we need to get you inside before you freeze." She tilted her head slightly like she was listening. I took another step. Then she lifted her face. Her eyes were black, not just dark, black, like two empty holes in her skull swallowing the light. I stumbled back. My breath caught in my throat. She opened her mouth, and then she started running toward me. I turned and bolted, my feet slipping in the snow, my pulse thundering in my ears. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The wind howled around me, the hospital lights flickering like dying candles. I slammed into the emergency doors, gasping, and spun around. She was gone. The woods were empty. The blood trail had vanished. I stood there panting, my breath coming out in thick white clouds. The radio on my hip crackled, a voice distorted, whispering through the static. "You shouldn't have followed." I ripped the radio off my belt and threw it to the ground. The rest of my shift, I avoided the windows. By morning, the snow had buried everything. No blood, no footprints. But when I checked the security footage, my blood ran cold. It showed me walking outside. It showed me staring at nothing. There was no woman in the woods. There never had been. But the hospital records told a different story. A patient had gone missing 10 years ago. She had been last seen in a hospital gown, and her name was still in the system, listed as admitted, but never discharged. Story number 9, the hallway that shouldn't exist. I had worked the night shift at the hospital for over a year, but I never felt truly alone until that night. The storm outside was relentless, piling snow against the windows, the wind howling through the empty corridors. Most of the patients were asleep. The only sounds coming from the rhythmic beeping of heart monitors and the occasional shuffle of the janitor's cart. It should have been a normal shift. But then I took a wrong turn. I'd been heading back from the supply closet, arms full of fresh linens, when I noticed something was off. The hallway I was in was too long, much longer than it should have been. The overhead lights flickered slightly, casting uneven shadows on the floor. The walls looked different. The usual white tile was replaced by something older, something yellowed with age. I stopped walking, a chill creeping up my spine. I knew this hospital. I knew its layout. I had walked this route 100 times, but this hallway wasn't supposed to be here. The air felt heavy, like the oxygen was thinning out. A soft hum vibrated through the walls, almost too low to hear, but enough to make my skin crawl. The temperature had dropped, my breath coming out in thin white clouds. I turned around ready to retrace my steps, but the hallway behind me wasn't the same one I had come from. I froze. The entrance to the supply room was gone. The signs on the walls were blank, the room numbers missing. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, an identical, repeating pattern of doors and flickering lights. I took a shaky breath. This isn't real. It's just exhaustion, a trick of the light. I started walking. My shoes echoed loudly against the floor, the sound unnaturally sharp in the emptiness. I tried the first door I passed. Locked. The next. Locked. Every single door was locked. And then I saw the first smudge of red, a small streak of blood near the base of one of the doors, as if someone had been dragged inside. I swallowed hard, my fingers twitching at my sides. Fluorescent lights buzzed louder, the hum from the walls turning into something almost mechanical, rhythmic. I picked up my pace. As I moved forward, the smudges of blood grew larger, handprints smeared against the doors, faint footprints in the white tile. Some streaks led under the doors, disappearing into whatever was behind them. My breathing turned shallow. I reached for my radio, fingers trembling as I pressed the button. "Hello? Can anyone hear me?" The response came immediately. "Where are you?" Static crackled between words, but I recognized the voice. It was the charge nurse at the front desk. I don't know," I admitted, my voice shaking. "I took the west corridor near the supply closet, but it's different. There are no signs. The doors are all locked." Silence. Then she said something that made my entire body turn cold. "There is no west corridor near the supply closet." I turned in a slow, stiff motion, feeling like something was watching me. The hallway stretched infinitely behind me, the same repeating pattern, the same flickering lights. Then the static shifted, and another voice came through, lower, scratched. "Wrong. Keep walking. You're almost here." My blood ran ice cold. That wasn't the charge nurse. That voice was too close. I dropped the radio. Something moved in the corner of my vision. I spun around, but nothing was there. The blood smears on the walls were fresh now. They hadn't been before. A door ahead of me creaked open, just slightly, just enough to see a sliver of darkness. Inside, I stepped back. A shadow moved behind it. And then a hand slid out, pale, thin, too long. It pressed against the door frame, fingers twitching, the nails too sharp, too dark. The breath in my chest turned to stone. The hand curled inward, beckoning. I turned and ran. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, my feet slamming against the tile, the hallway stretching and twisting as the lights flickered violently. A door to my right burst open as I passed. I didn't look. I could hear them now. Footsteps. Too many. Too fast. Something whispered my name. I wasn't going to make it. Then, a door ahead of me opened on its own. Bright light poured through it. I didn't stop to think. I dove inside, and suddenly, I was back. The real hospital hallway. Everything was normal. The air was warm again. The walls were white. The doors had numbers. I collapsed against the wall, gasping, my chest burning. A nurse turned the corner, frowning at me. "Hey, are you okay? You look..." She hesitated. Her eyes flickered to the door I had just come through. I turned to look. It was a janitor's closet. Not a hallway. Not a long, endless corridor. Just a closet. The door was already locked. I swallowed thickly, my heart hammering against my ribs. I forced myself to nod. "Yeah," I whispered, just got lost. The nurse gave me an odd look but didn't question it. I never took that route again, but sometimes when I pass by the janitor's closet, I swear I hear it. A slow, deliberate knock. From the inside. Story number 10. The elevator ritual. I didn't believe the stories at first. The elevator ritual was just another urban legend, a stupid hospital myth that got passed around during slow night shifts. The nurses whispered about it in the break room, how if you pressed the basement button 3 times at midnight, the elevator would take you to a floor that doesn't exist. They called it the in-between floor. The stories varied. Some said it was a forgotten wing, abandoned years ago. Others claimed it was a place that never belonged to the hospital at all, a place that shouldn't be real. And the worst part? Once you got there, you weren't alone. I laughed it off when I first heard it, but on one particularly slow night, as the snowstorm raged outside, trapping us in the hospital, I found myself standing in front of the old service elevator, staring at the worn buttons. It was exactly 11:59 p.m. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was stupidity. Or maybe some part of me wanted to prove it wasn't real. The clock on my phone ticked over to midnight. I reached out and pressed B, then again, and again. The elevator lurched violently, making my stomach drop. The old lights flickered, buzzing angrily as the metal groaned. I felt a strange pull, like gravity had shifted, like something was pressing me down. Then the doors slid open, and I realized I had made a mistake. The hallway before me was wrong. It was still a hospital, but not this hospital. The walls were yellowed with age, the paint peeling like dead skin. The floor was covered in a thin layer of frost, the air thick with the smell of rotting antiseptic. The lights above flickered in erratic patterns, some buzzing, some completely dead. I should have stayed inside the elevator, but my feet moved forward on their own. The doors slid shut behind me. The hallway stretched out in both directions, identical, endless. The only sign of life was the row of empty hospital beds lined up neatly along the walls. They were all turned to face the same way, facing me. My pulse pounded in my ears. A small, blinking call light flickered at the end of the corridor. Room 414. I had the sickest feeling in my gut, but I forced myself to move. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, the sound stretching longer than it should have. The walls felt too tight, as if the hallway was closing in. I stopped in front of room 414. The door was slightly ajar. A slow, steady beeping came from inside, the kind you hear from a heart monitor. I pushed the door open. The bed was occupied. A patient lay motionless, a thin sheet pulled up to their chest. Their face was covered, as if they had just died. The heart monitor kept beeping, but the more I listened, the more I realized it wasn't the sound of a heartbeat. It was something else, something teen. I backed away, my body screaming at me to run. But before I could move, the sheet slid off. There was nothing underneath, just the imprint of where a body should have been. The lights flickered violently. The air grew thick, suffocating. And then, from under the bed, I heard it. The sound of something crawling. A long, slow, dragging motion. My feet finally obeyed. I turned and bolted back to the elevator, my lungs burning, the walls shifting and stretching as if the corridor was alive. I slammed my fist against the elevator button, over and over, praying, begging. Behind me, the beds started moving, not rolling, turning. One by one, they twisted on their wheels, all of them facing me again. Then the whisper came. "Why did you come here?" The voice was not human. The elevator doors finally slid open. I threw myself inside and slammed the close button. For a sickening moment, the doors wouldn't shut. Something moved in the hallway. Tall, thin, twisted, its head tilted sharply, its limbs too long, its fingers twitching as it reached for me. The doors slammed shut. The elevator shook violently. I squeezed my eyes shut, my heart hammering in my chest, and then silence. When the doors opened again, I was back. The real hospital, the normal hallway, the warm, buzzing fluorescent lights. I stumbled out, my legs barely holding me up. I turned back to look at the elevator. The B button was missing. I never spoke about what happened, never told a soul. But sometimes, when I pass by that elevator, I swear I can hear it, the sound of something crawling. Story number 11, the newborn with black eyes. The first time I saw him, I felt something in my chest tighten, like my body knew before my mind did that something was very, very wrong. I had been working the night shift in the maternity ward for years, but I had never seen a baby like him. He had been born during the worst snowstorm of the season, the kind that buried cars under 6 feet of white and left the hospital in near silence. The roads were impassable, and most of the staff had gone home before the blizzard hit. That left me 2 nurses and 1 exhausted doctor to handle the entire floor. At around 3:12 a.m., the emergency buzzer went off. The mother had gone into sudden labor, and with no time to transport her to a larger hospital, we had to deliver the baby right there in the small maternity wing. The labor was fast, too fast. No screaming, no struggle, just one long, rattling breath from the mother. And then silence as the baby slipped into the world. A baby who never cried. He just lay there perfectly still, his small chest rising and falling in slow, even breaths. At first I thought he wasn't breathing at all. I reached out, pressing 2 fingers against his tiny wrist, feeling for a pulse. It was there, steady, strong, but his body was cold. And then I saw his eyes. They were black, not dark blue like newborns usually have, not brown, not even gray. Pure, solid, black. My stomach twisted. I had seen premature babies, babies with deformities, babies who came into the world too sick to survive, but never this. The mother lay limp on the bed, her chest barely moving. She turned her head toward me, her lips pale and cracked. Her voice was so soft I almost didn't hear it. "That's not my baby." The words sent an icy wave of fear down my spine. I forced a smile. "You're exhausted. Sometimes labor can be disorienting. That's not my baby," she whispered again, stronger this time. Her fingers dug into the sheets, her eyes wide with something close to terror. I glanced at the doctor, but he wouldn't meet my gaze. His hands were shaking as he cut the umbilical cord. I had never seen a doctor shake like that. The nurses carried the baby to the incubator, but something inside me told me not to put him down. I didn't. The moment he left my arms, temperature in the room dropped. The overhead lights flickered. The machines around us hiccuped, the monitors blipping with static before returning to normal. The baby remained silent. The mother tried to sit up, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "Please," she begged, "take him away. He's not mine." The doctor frowned but said nothing. He motioned for me to take the baby to the nursery, and against my better judgment, I obeyed. The maternity ward was dead silent as I wheeled the small crib toward the rows of sleeping newborns. The blizzard outside pressed against the windows, ice crackling along the edges of the glass. I placed him in the incubator, my hands trembling as I adjusted the blanket around his tiny body. And that's when his eyes moved. Not his head, Not his body, just his eyes, rolling upward, shifting in his skull until they locked onto mine. I couldn't breathe. The heart monitors around the room flatlined. Every single one. The babies, all of them began to stir, their bodies twitching in unison. The nursery filled with a sound I can't even describe. Something between a sigh and a rattle, like 100 tiny lungs exhaling at once. I backed away, my pulse thundering in my ears. And then the black-eyed baby smiled. It wasn't a baby's smile. It was too wide, too knowing. I grabbed the emergency phone on the wall, my fingers fumbling as I dialed the doctor's extension. No dial tone. The storm must have knocked out the lines. I turned back to the incubator, but the baby was gone. The blanket lay in a neat, undisturbed pile. I spun around, my breath coming in short gasps. Where? How? The incubator was enclosed, latched shut. There was no way he could have. A soft sound made my blood turn to ice. A wet gurgle. I turned slowly, my stomach twisting into knots. He was standing in the crib. Newborns can't stand. Newborns can't grin. But he was. His mouth stretched impossibly wide, his tiny hands gripping the rails of the crib. His black eyes locked onto mine. The lights blew out. I don't remember running, but the next thing I knew, I was standing in the middle of the hallway, my breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. The nursery behind me was dark. And then the crying started. Not just one baby, all of them, screaming, wailing. The hallway felt longer than before. The overhead lights flickered, casting shadows that moved in ways they shouldn't. The doctor appeared at the end of the hall, his face pale. He took one look at me and then at the nursery door, shaking his head. "We need to go," he said. I didn't ask questions. We left the floor together, neither of us speaking, neither of us looking back. By morning, the storm had cleared. The hospital was back to normal. But when I checked the records, there was no admission for the mother, no birth certificate, no record of a black-eyed baby. The nurses claimed the nursery had been empty all night, that there were no newborns at all. But when I looked back at the incubator, I saw it, a single tiny handprint, pressed against the glass. I don't work in maternity anymore, but sometimes in the middle of the night I hear it, a soft, wet gurgle, like a baby trying to laugh. If you made it this far, you're definitely someone who loves a good scare. If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more terrifying tales. And if you've ever had a horror experience of your own, share it in the comments below. I'd love to read them. Now, if you dare, check out the videos appearing on your screen. But be careful. Some stories have a way of staying with you.